Rain hammered Manhattan that morning, the kind of cold, relentless rain that made the city smell like wet concrete and impatience. Traffic crawled along Fifth Avenue, and umbrellas bloomed like black flowers on every corner. Sophia Reed, no, Sophia Laurent now, though the old name still surfaced in her mind sometimes, stepped out of her car in front of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. She had a folder tucked under one arm, filled with seating charts and vendor confirmations for the International Charity Gala she was hosting in 4 days. 300 guests, $12 million in expected donations, and she intended for every detail to be flawless. She didn't notice the black SUV until it was too late. It came fast, cutting too close to the curb, tires slicing through a pothole filled ankle-deep with muddy rainwater. The wave rose like something out of a nightmare and crashed over her. Her coat, her blouse, the folder in her arms, all of it soaked in an instant. Gasps rippled from the doorman and a few passers-by. For a moment, Sophia just stood there, dripping, stunned. Then the SUV's window rolled down. A man leaned out, laughing. Actually laughing, the kind of laugh that comes easily to someone who has never once considered that his actions might cost someone else something. He had the same sharp jaw, the same expensive haircut, the same smug tilt of the head she remembered from years ago, back when she used to wake up next to that face and tell herself she was lucky. Daniel Reed, her ex-husband. He looked at her, really looked, the recognition landing somewhere behind his eyes, and instead of the apology any decent stranger would offer, he grinned wider. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, raising his voice over the rain so the doorman could hear too. "Sophia, still haven't lost the weight, huh?" He shook his head, almost fondly, the way someone might reminisce about a joke that never got old. "Guess life hasn't been kind to you since I left." Sophia said nothing. Water dripped from her lashes. Her hands, still clutching the ruined folder, didn't shake. Daniel didn't wait for a response. He didn't want one. He was already checking his watch, already thinking about something more important than the woman standing in the street soaked to the bone. "Anyway, can't be late," he called out, and the SUV pulled away, merging smoothly back into traffic, like nothing had happened at all. Like she was nothing at all. The doorman rushed over with a towel and a flurry of apologies that weren't his to give. Sophia waved him off gently. "I'm fine, Marcus," she said, and her voice was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. "Really?" But she stood there another moment, watching the SUV's taillights disappear into the gray morning, and let herself feel it, just for a second. The old, familiar sting of being laughed at, of being reduced to a body, a number on a scale, a joke Daniel could still tell 4 years after their divorce, like it was the funniest thing he'd ever said. 4 years. 4 years since he'd stood in front of 300 wedding guests. Not their guests. His colleague's wedding. A room full of people who mattered to his career, and made a comment about the dessert table that made everyone laugh except her. 4 years since he'd filed for divorce 2 weeks later, telling their mutual friends he needed a partner who could keep up, like she was a treadmill he'd outgrown. 4 years since she had walked out of that marriage with nothing but a suitcase and a promise to herself she would never again let anyone make her feel small enough to disappear. She had kept that promise, slowly, quietly, without any interest in proving it to Daniel or anyone like him. She'd thrown herself into charity work, first as a volunteer, then as a coordinator, then as someone people sought out because she got results. She'd traveled to refugee camps in Eastern Europe and disaster zones in Southeast Asia, and somewhere in the middle of all that unglamorous, exhausting, meaningful work, she'd met a quiet man with tired eyes and a private jet who didn't ask her a single question about her weight, her clothes, or her plans to change herself. He'd asked about her work instead, And then he'd asked her to marry him. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, dripping in his own arrogance as his SUV vanished down the avenue, was that the woman he'd just humiliated in the street was no longer just Sophia Reed, a name he could mock and discard. She was Sophia Laurent, wife of Adrien Laurent. To the public, Adrien was one of the most private billionaire investors in Europe, a man who rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in photographs, and moved with the kind of quiet authority that made rooms go still when he entered them. To a much smaller circle, in whispered conversations that never made it into any newspaper, Adrien Laurent was something else entirely. The man who sat, unseen and untouchable, at the center of one of Europe's most powerful criminal networks. Nothing moved in certain circles without his knowledge. No one crossed him twice, and in exactly 6 hours, in a glass conference room 40 floors above the drenched streets of the financial district, Daniel Reed was walking straight into a $20 billion negotiation, the biggest deal of his career, with the very man whose wife he had just humiliated in the rain. He had no idea. Sophia handed the ruined folder to Marcus, straightened her soaked coat, and walked into the hotel lobby without looking back. Whatever was coming for Daniel Reed, she told herself, she would let it come on its own. She just didn't yet know how far Adrien was willing to go to make sure it did. By the time Daniel Reed stepped out of the elevator on the 40th floor of Laurent Global Holdings, he'd already forgotten about the woman in the rain. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the glass wall, ran a hand through hair still damp from the storm outside, and reminded himself what was at stake. $20 billion. A technology partnership that would fuse his company's data infrastructure with Laurent Global's international reach, opening markets across 3 continents. If this deal closed, Reed Dynamics wouldn't just be a mid-tier tech firm anymore. It would be a name people said in the same breath as the giants. All he had to do was impress one man. Adrien Laurent's reputation preceded him. A billionaire who rarely met with anyone personally, who was said to make decisions in silence and rarely explain them. Daniel had spent weeks preparing. He had rehearsed his pitch until it felt effortless, memorized every projection, every contingency. He was ready. He was not ready for the man himself. Adrien Laurent stood when Daniel entered the conference room, and something about his stillness immediately unsettled the air. And he wasn't an imposing man in the physical sense. Trim, gray at the temples, dressed in a suit so quietly expensive it didn't need to announce itself. But his eyes moved slowly, deliberately, as though he were reading Daniel the way other men read contracts. He offered a handshake, firm and brief. "Mr. Reed," Adrien said, "thank you for coming." "The pleasure's mine," Daniel replied, flashing the smile that had closed 100 deals before this one. "I've heard a great deal about your work, Mr. Laurent. It's an honor." Adrien said nothing to that. He simply gestured for Daniel to sit, and the meeting began. For the first 20 minutes, everything went according to plan. Daniel walked through his projections with practiced confidence, fielding questions from Adrien's executives with the smooth authority that had made him a rising star in his industry. He was good at this, genuinely good, and for a moment, watching the nods around the table, he let himself believe the deal was already halfway won. Then the door opened, and a woman walked in. She moved quietly, taking a seat near the head of the table beside Adrien, setting down a leather folio and a phone. She wore a tailored navy dress, her hair pulled back, her expression composed and entirely unreadable. Daniel barely glanced at her. Some assistant, he assumed, probably here to take notes or fetch coffee for the real decision-makers. It wasn't until Adrien spoke that Daniel's eyes lingered a second longer than they should have. "This is Sophia," Adrien said, without looking up from his tablet. "Chairwoman of the Laurent Foundation. She oversees all our humanitarian partnerships, and any agreement we make today will eventually intersect with her division's work. Daniel nodded politely, filing the name away without much thought. Sophia, common enough name. He returned his attention to the slide on the screen, already moving on to his next point. He never looked closely enough to recognize her. Sophia, for her part, said nothing. She opened her folio, glanced briefly at the notes inside, and let her gaze settle on Daniel with the same calm, professional neutrality she offered every other person in the room. If her heart was pounding, and it was, quietly, beneath the still surface she'd built over 4 hard years, none of it reached her face. She had wondered, on the drive over, what she would feel sitting across from him again, this time in a room where he had no idea who she'd become. She'd expected anger, maybe, or a strange, hollow satisfaction. What she felt instead was simpler than either. She felt nothing she needed to prove. Adrian, however, was paying closer attention than anyone realized. He noticed the small water stain still darkening the leather strap of Sophia's handbag where she'd set it beside her chair. A faint muddy ring that hadn't fully dried, despite the fresh clothes and composed makeup. He noticed, too, the way Sophia's hand had tightened almost imperceptibly around her pen the moment Daniel's name appeared on the meeting itinerary that morning. Adrian rarely asked questions when a room could answer them for him. He simply watched and stored what he saw, the way he'd built his fortune and everything beneath it, patiently, and without ever showing his hand first. He said nothing about the mud stain, not yet. The meeting continued for another hour, Daniel's presentation sliding smoothly from technical specifications to long-term projections, each point landing exactly where he wanted it to. By the time the executives began gathering their things, several of Adrian's senior team members were nodding, with something close to enthusiasm. It was, by any measure, a strong opening. Daniel shook hands on his way out, thanked Adrian for his time, and even offered Sophia a brief, distracted nod on his way past. The kind of courtesy extended to someone whose name you've already forgotten. "Ms. Laurent," he said absently, misremembering even that. "It's Sophia," she corrected, her voice even, giving nothing away. He didn't catch the last name at all. He was already halfway out the door, already composing the celebratory email he'd send his team the moment he reached the elevator. Behind him, Adrian finally turned to his wife, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had sharpened. "You didn't tell him," he said quietly, once the door had closed. "There was nothing to tell," Sophia replied, closing her folio. "Not yet." Adrian studied her a moment longer, the way he studied everything, before deciding what to do with it. "Then I suppose," he said, "we'll let him find out, on his own time." Outside the glass walls of the conference room, the rain had finally started to ease over the city. Daniel Reed walked out of the building, certain he'd just taken his first confident step toward the deal of a lifetime. He had no idea he'd just walked out past the one person who could end it. The negotiations moved into their second day, this time at a smaller conference space in Brooklyn, overlooking the East River, where Laurent Global kept a satellite office for meetings that required more discretion than the glass tower downtown offered. Daniel arrived early, buoyed by the previous day's momentum, certain the deal was all but sealed. He'd barely slept, running numbers in his head instead, imagining headlines with his name in them. He found Sophia first, before the others arrived, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching a tugboat push slowly against the current. "There she is," Daniel said, walking over with the easy confidence of a man who'd already decided the room belonged to him. "The foundation lady. I didn't get your full name yesterday." "Sophia Laurent," she said, not turning around immediately. Something in the surname caught, briefly, at the edge of his attention. A flicker, gone as quickly as it came. He assumed it was simply an employee's married name, nothing worth dwelling on. Laurent, he repeated. Family connection to the boss? Or just good luck? Something like that, Sophia said. Daniel laughed, missing the layers folded into her answer entirely. He leaned against the window frame, studying her, with the casual, appraising look of someone who'd once made a habit of studying her and finding fault. So how does someone land a job like this? Charity work, big office, view like this? He gestured vaguely at the window. Lucky break? Or did you know somebody? The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation, dressed up as small talk, the same tone he used to take with her years ago whenever she'd accomplished something he didn't expect from her, as if her successes needed explaining, as if she couldn't possibly have earned them the plain, hard way. Sophia turned to face him then, and for the first time, she let a small, unreadable smile settle on her face. I worked for it, she said simply. The way most people do. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Some old instinct in him, sensing a version of Sophia he didn't recognize. Steadier, unbothered by him, in a way she'd never quite managed to be during their marriage. It irritated him, though he couldn't have said exactly why. He didn't get the chance to press further. The rest of the negotiating team filed in, and the day's business began. Later that evening, alone in the quiet of her Manhattan apartment, Sophia found herself thinking back further than she wanted to. She remembered Daniel at 28, charming and ambitious, sweeping her off her feet with a confidence that had once felt like safety. She remembered their wedding, small and hopeful. She remembered, too, the slow erosion that came after, the comments that started as jokes and hardened into habit. You'd be stunning if you just lost a little weight, babe. Just for the gala, just for my colleague's wedding, just for the photos. Every just, a small chip against something in her that had once felt whole. She remembered the wedding reception 4 years ago. Not their wedding, his business partner's, where Daniel had leaned toward a table of investors and, gesturing at the dessert spread, said with a grin, "Careful. Don't let my wife near the cake table. We'll need a bigger car." And the whole table had laughed, and Sophia had laughed too, because that was what she'd learned to do. Laugh along, make herself small in exactly the way he wanted, so the humiliation would end faster. 2 weeks later, he filed for divorce. He told mutual friends he needed a partner who could keep up with his lifestyle. He never once said the real reason out loud, but everyone understood it anyway. Sophia remembered packing her things into a single suitcase, remembered the strange, disorienting quiet of an empty apartment, remembered crying in a way she'd promised herself she wouldn't. And she remembered, distinctly, the morning after, waking up and making a decision that had nothing to do with losing weight, or changing her body, or becoming someone Daniel might have approved of. She decided, instead, to become someone she respected. She started small, a volunteer shift at a local shelter, then a coordinator role at an international relief organization, packing donation boxes at 6 a.m. before her regular job. Then trips abroad, refugee camps in Eastern Europe, flood relief in Southeast Asia, work that had nothing glamorous about it and everything meaningful. She built a name for herself slowly, one project at a time, never once trying to prove anything to Daniel, because somewhere in that work, she'd stopped thinking about him entirely. It was in a rebuilding project outside Warsaw 3 years ago that she'd met Adrian, a quiet, unassuming man in a plain gray coat, standing at the edge of a construction site, asking careful questions about supply logistics instead of posing for photographs like the other donors did. She hadn't known, at first, who he was. He hadn't offered his full name for weeks. What she'd known was simpler. He listened. He asked about her work, her ideas, her frustrations with slow bureaucracy, never once about her weight, her appearance, or what she should be doing differently to be more presentable. By the time she learned the full scope of who Adrien Laurent was, the empire, the influence, the parts of his world that stayed carefully out of public view, she had already fallen for the man who asked good questions in a gray coat. The rest, she'd decided, she could navigate as it came. Now, sitting in her apartment, with the city lights blinking against the window, Sophia realized the past she'd worked so hard to leave behind was sitting across a negotiating table from her husband, utterly unaware of what he was walking into. She wasn't afraid of what came next. She was only, quietly, curious how long it would take Daniel Reed to understand exactly what he'd lost, and exactly who he'd have to answer to for the way he'd lost it. The negotiations moved to Boston on the third day, to Laurent Global's Innovation Center, a sprawling glass campus, tucked along the Charles River, all clean lines and quiet efficiency. Daniel arrived expecting to close out the final terms within 48 hours. Instead, he found himself increasingly frustrated by a man who seemed in no hurry at all. Adrien asked more questions than Daniel anticipated. He requested additional financial disclosures. He wanted a second round of due diligence on Reed Dynamics client contracts, then a third. Every time Daniel believed they were nearing a signature, Adrien introduced some new consideration, calm and unhurried, offering no real explanation beyond a quiet, "We prefer to be thorough." "With respect," Daniel said on the second evening, standing in a glass-walled meeting room as the sun set orange over the river. "We've been thorough for 3 days. My board is expecting a signed term sheet by Friday." Adrien looked up from the documents in front of him, unbothered by the edge in Daniel's voice. "Deals of this size," he said evenly, "are not measured by how quickly they close. They're measured by what they cost you later, if you close them carelessly." Daniel didn't understand yet how literally Adrien meant that. What Daniel didn't know was that the delays had very little to do with financial disclosures at all. 2 nights earlier, after the meeting in Brooklyn, Adrien had called his head of security into his private study, a compact, precise man named Marcus Whitfield, who had worked for Adrien for over a decade and understood, without ever needing it spelled out, the difference between an ordinary background check and the kind Adrien was now requesting. "I want everything," Adrien had said simply. "Not just the company, the man." "Reed Dynamics is clean," Whitfield had replied. "We ran the standard checks before the first meeting. No red flags." "I'm not asking about the company," Adrien said. "I'm asking about Daniel Reed." Whitfield had paused, studying his employer for a moment, sensing there was a reason behind the request that hadn't been stated outright. Adrien rarely explained himself, and Whitfield rarely needed him to. He nodded once and got to work. What came back, over the following 2 days, was more revealing than either of them expected. Security footage, pulled discreetly from a nearby camera on the morning of the mud incident, confirmed what Sophia had never directly told her husband. Daniel had swerved deliberately through the pothole, not swept up by traffic, as any reasonable explanation might suggest, but visibly, intentionally aiming the SUV's path toward her. The footage showed him laughing before he even rolled down the window. It wasn't an accident, dressed up as poor luck. It was a choice. That alone might have been dismissed as a single, ugly moment, the kind of cruelty that surfaces once and means little in isolation. But Whitfield's investigation didn't stop there. Former colleagues of Daniel's, contacted under the pretense of standard employment verification, offered comments that painted a consistent pattern rather than an isolated flaw. A former assistant described being belittled in front of clients for minor scheduling errors. A driver who'd once worked for Reed Dynamics recalled being screamed at over a delayed pickup. then fired the same week, without explanation. A hotel concierge in Chicago remembered Daniel complaining loudly about a waiter's attitude after the man had simply asked him to wait his turn at a crowded bar. A complaint that got the young waiter suspended for 2 weeks pending review. None of these incidents alone would end a $20 billion deal. Together, they formed a shape Adrian recognized instantly. The shape of a man who mistreated anyone he believed held no power over him, and who reserved his charm exclusively for those who did. Adrian read the full file late at night, alone in his study, the lamp casting long shadows across the pages. He didn't react visibly. He simply closed the folder, set it aside, and sat for a long while in the quiet, turning something over in his mind that had little to do with mud or marriages, and everything to do with what kind of partner he was willing to build an empire beside. Sophia found him there, near midnight, still awake, the folder closed on the desk in front of him. She didn't need to ask what it contained. She'd suspected, from the moment Daniel's name first appeared on the deal itinerary, that Adrian would eventually look deeper than the surface. "You had him investigated," she said quietly, more statement than question. "I have everyone investigated," Adrian replied. "It's simply thorough business." "That's not what this is," Sophia said, sitting across from him. "Adrian, I don't want this to be about me." He looked at her then, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, the closest he came, in most moments, to open emotion. "It isn't only about you," he said, "but I won't pretend it started as something else." "Whatever you decide," Sophia said carefully, "I need it to be fair. Judge the deal on its merits, not on what he did to me 4 years ago, or what he doesn't know today. If you destroy him just to settle an old score, it won't feel like justice. It'll feel like revenge, wearing a nicer suit." Adrian considered this for a long moment, his eyes steady on hers. "And if the evidence stands on its own," he asked quietly, "without needing revenge to justify it, if the man's character alone disqualifies him?" Sophia held his gaze. "Then let the evidence speak. Not you, not me, just what's true." Adrian nodded slowly, something settling behind his eyes. Not a promise exactly, but an understanding. "Then we'll let it continue to unfold," he said, "and we'll see exactly who Daniel Reed shows himself to be, when he still believes no one is watching closely enough to notice." Outside the study window, the Charles River moved dark and steady beneath the city lights, indifferent to the quiet war being decided in the room above it, a war Daniel didn't yet know he was fighting, against an opponent he still believed was simply a cautious billionaire, thorough about diligence, and nothing more. The 5th day brought the negotiations to Adrian's private estate in Vermont, a sprawling stone property tucked into rolling hills, chosen deliberately for the kind of conversations that didn't belong in a boardroom. Senior executives from both companies gathered for a dinner meant to smooth the final terms before signatures, the kind of evening built on good wine and careful diplomacy. Daniel arrived in high spirits. The due diligence, however delayed, had finally cleared. His lawyers had reviewed the latest draft of the term sheet that afternoon and found nothing left to negotiate. As far as he was concerned, this dinner was a formality, a victory lap before Friday's signature made it official. He dressed carefully for the evening, rehearsing small talk for the executives he hadn't yet charmed, running through numbers he could casually drop into conversation to remind everyone exactly why Reed Dynamics deserved this deal. By the time he walked into the estate's dining hall, he felt, for the first time in days, entirely in control. The long table was set with quiet elegance, low candlelight, understated china, the kind of restraint that spoke of wealth, too old and too comfortable to need showing off. Daniel found his seat near the middle of the table, several places down from Adrian, and across from Sophia, who arrived a few minutes later, in a deep green dress, her hair loose for the first time since the negotiations began. It was the ring that caught his eye first. A wedding band, simple but unmistakable, catching the candlelight as she reached for her water glass. Daniel's gaze lingered on it, a beat too long, something clicking into place. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough to sharpen his curiosity. "Didn't peg you for the married type," he said, leaning slightly across the table, his tone light, performative, the kind of comment meant to be charming in front of an audience. "Who's the lucky man? Some accountant? School teacher?" He smiled, glancing sideways at the executives near him, gathering an audience the way he always did before landing a joke. "Honestly, good for whoever it is. Takes a special kind of guy to not mind inheriting my leftovers." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through a few of the junior executives, quickly swallowed as they registered how still the table had gone. Sophia didn't flinch. She set her water glass down carefully, her expression unreadable, and said nothing at all, because she didn't need to. It was Adrian who moved first. He set down his own glass, unhurried, and turned his head toward Daniel with an expression that hadn't changed in tone or temperature, though something behind his eyes had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man who has decided, in that instant, exactly what he intends to do, and is simply choosing the moment to do it. He reached across the space between them and placed his hand gently over Sophia's. Over the ring Daniel had just mocked. "She's not someone's leftover," Adrian said, quietly, in a voice that didn't need volume to fill the room. "She's my wife." The words landed like a held breath, released all at once. For a moment, nobody at the table moved. A junior executive near the end set down her fork with a small, audible clink that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Somewhere, a candle guttered against a draft no one else noticed. Daniel's smile remained frozen on his face for a beat too long, the expression outliving the confidence that had built it. His eyes moved from Adrian's hand, resting over Sophia's, to Sophia's face. Searching, disbelieving, waiting for someone to tell him this was some kind of joke, an elaborate misunderstanding he could laugh off the way he laughed off everything. No one said anything. "You're—" Daniel started, then stopped, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. He looked at Sophia again, and this time he actually saw her, not the woman from 4 years ago he'd carried around in his memory as a punchline, not the foundation lady he'd dismissed on his first day here, but the woman sitting across from him now, composed, unshaken, married to the single most powerful man in the room. Possibly, though he didn't yet know the full scope of it, one of the most powerful men on the entire East Coast. The realization moved through him in visible stages. Disbelief, then something closer to dread. The particular dread of a man who suddenly understands he has been performing arrogance in front of an audience whose power he never accounted for. Around the table, the other executives exchanged careful glances, the kind that passed silent understanding between people who knew instantly that something had shifted permanently in the balance of this deal. A few of them had heard whispers about Adrian Laurent over the years, stories that never made the papers, names never confirmed. A reputation built on the things people didn't say out loud, rather than the things they did. Whatever those whispers meant, every person at that table now understood with sudden clarity that Daniel Reed had just insulted the wife of a man who did not forgive carelessly. Sophia finally spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. "You should be more careful," she said, "about who you assume has nothing." Daniel opened his mouth, some apology or excuse rising instinctively, the way it always had, whenever he sensed he'd overstepped with someone who mattered. But nothing came out. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Reed had absolutely no idea what to say. The dinner continued around him, conversation slowly, awkwardly resuming at the far ends of the table, but Daniel barely heard any of it. He sat frozen in his seat, staring at his own hands. The $20 billion deal he'd been so certain of an hour ago, suddenly feeling like sand, slipping fast between his fingers. Across the table, Adrian returned to his meal with the same unhurried calm he'd carried into the room, as though nothing at all had happened. But Sophia knew better. She had seen that same stillness in him once before, right before he made a decision that could not be undone. And she suspected Daniel was about to learn exactly what that meant. By the time the group reconvened in Washington, D.C. 2 days later, Daniel Reed was a different man, or at least he was trying very hard to appear that way. Gone was the easy swagger, the casual jokes, the assumption that every room existed to admire him. In its place was a careful, almost desperate politeness that fooled no one, least of all Sophia. He held doors. He complimented the Foundation's latest housing initiative with genuine-sounding enthusiasm. He asked after her flight, her schedule, whether the hotel accommodations were to her liking, questions he had never once asked her in 3 years of marriage. He cornered her on the second morning, outside a conference room overlooking the Capitol, coffee in hand as a peace offering. "Sophia," he said, and there was something almost pleading in the way he said her name now, so different from the mocking tone he'd used in the rain a week earlier. "I need you to know what I said back at the estate, and that morning outside the hotel. I was out of line. I was cruel. I should never have—" "Daniel." Sophia's voice was calm, cutting through his rehearsed apology without raising in volume at all. "Stop." He stopped. She studied him for a moment, this man who had once made her feel invisible in rooms full of people, who was now standing in front of her, holding coffee like an offering to a god he'd just discovered he'd insulted. There was something almost sad about it, she thought. Not sad for him, but sad for the version of herself who might once have accepted this apology gratefully, relieved simply to be noticed with kindness instead of contempt. "You're not apologizing because you understand what you did," she said. "You're apologizing because you found out who I married." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but the words died somewhere behind his teeth, because they both knew she was right. "4 years ago," Sophia continued, her voice steady, "you humiliated me in front of your colleagues at a wedding that wasn't even mine to remember fondly. You called me names in private I still haven't fully forgiven myself for believing. You left me with nothing but a suitcase and told our friends I couldn't keep up with your lifestyle." She paused. "I had nothing then, Daniel. No power, no leverage, no husband whose name could end your company with a phone call, and in 4 years, you never once tried to apologize. Not a card, not a call, nothing." "I didn't think—" Daniel started. "You didn't think it mattered," Sophia finished for him. "Because I didn't matter. Not until today, when you realized I might." The silence between them stretched long enough that Daniel finally set the coffee down on a nearby table, as though the gesture had lost all its meaning, now that she'd named exactly what it was. "You had years to apologize when I had nothing," Sophia said finally, quiet and even, each word landing with more weight than any anger could have carried. "You chose today because I finally have something you want." She turned and walked back into the conference room, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway with a cooling cup of coffee and the particular hollow feeling of a man who has just heard the truth about himself spoken aloud for the first time. He didn't have long to sit with it. That afternoon, word arrived that shattered whatever fragile momentum remained in the negotiations. A rival technology conglomerate, one that had lost out on early conversations with Laurent Global months earlier, had filed an aggressive legal challenge, alleging that portions of Reed Dynamics' core software architecture had been developed using stolen intellectual property from a smaller startup the rival had since acquired. The claim was thin, built more on innuendo than evidence, but it was timed with surgical precision, designed to detonate exactly when the deal was most vulnerable. Within hours, financial news outlets picked up the story. Reed Dynamics' stock dipped sharply. Two nervous board members from Adrian's side quietly requested an emergency call, questioning whether the entire agreement should be paused pending investigation. Daniel, to his credit, didn't collapse under the pressure. Whatever else could be said about him, he was undeniably skilled at his work, and he threw himself into damage control with the same intensity he'd once reserved for closing deals, pulling together documentation, engineers, and legal counsel through the night to build a defense against the claims. Sophia watched it unfold from the periphery of the crisis meetings, noting something she hadn't expected to see. Genuine strain on Daniel's face, the particular exhaustion of a man fighting for something real, not performing for an audience. It was, she thought, the first time in the entire negotiation she'd seen him without the mask. Adrian, for his part, remained largely silent through the chaos, watching from behind steepled fingers as his own legal team quietly assessed the rival's claims in parallel with Daniel's frantic defense. He said little in the emergency calls, offered no reassurances, made no promises about the deal's survival. But late that night, after the worst of the immediate crisis had been managed and the stock had stabilized on assurances of an internal review, Adrian turned to Sophia in the quiet of their hotel suite and said something that surprised her. "He handled that well," Adrian said simply. "Better than most would have." Sophia looked at her husband carefully. "Does that change anything?" Adrian considered the question for a long moment, his eyes distant, weighing something she couldn't quite read. "Talent," he said finally, "was never the question I was asking. The rival's legal challenge turned out to be only the opening move." 3 days later, in Chicago, where the final rounds of technical integration meetings were scheduled at Laurent Global's Midwest data center, a far more serious threat surfaced, one that had nothing to do with lawyers and everything to do with lines of code moving quietly through systems that were never supposed to be touched. It began just after midnight. A junior systems analyst noticed unusual traffic patterns in the servers hosting the joint due diligence data room, the shared repository containing sensitive financial records, proprietary source code, and confidential client contracts from both companies, assembled in preparation for the deal's final signature. By 1 a.m., it was clear the traffic wasn't a glitch. Someone was inside the system, moving carefully, extracting data in small enough increments to avoid tripping standard alerts. By 2 a.m., emergency calls had gone out to nearly everyone involved in the negotiation. Daniel arrived at the data center, still in the sweatpants he'd been sleeping in, hair uncombed, laptop bag slung over one shoulder, looking nothing like the polished executive who'd walked into that first meeting a week and a half earlier. He didn't waste time on appearances. "Pull the external mirror offline first," he said the moment he reached the command center, cutting through the confused chatter of Laurent Global's night shift technicians. "If they're routing through a shadow server, ending the primary connection just tells them we've noticed. We isolate the mirror, trace the exfiltration path, and shut the door behind them before they know we're onto it." The lead engineer, a woman named Priya, who had worked cybersecurity for Adrian's companies for 6 years, looked at him with open skepticism for exactly as long as it took to realize he was right. Within 20 minutes, working side by side, Daniel and Priya's team had traced the intrusion to a compromised vendor credential, almost certainly planted weeks earlier by the same rival conglomerate behind the legal challenge, laying groundwork for exactly this moment. For the next 6 hours, Daniel didn't stop moving. He rewrote authentication protocols on the fly, walked junior technicians through emergency containment procedures, and personally rebuilt 2 corrupted database indexes, that would have taken the standard recovery process nearly 2 days to restore. By sunrise, the breach was sealed, the stolen data limited to a handful of non-critical files, and the deal's most sensitive information remained untouched. It was, by every technical measure, an impressive performance, the kind of crisis leadership that built legends inside companies. Adrian arrived at the data center just as the last systems came back fully online, having been briefed by phone through the night. He walked the length of the command center slowly, taking in the exhausted, coffee-fueled team still hunched over their monitors, and then found Daniel at the far end, running a final diagnostic check with red-rimmed eyes and a stillness that hadn't been there before this week. "You saved us several $100 million tonight," Adrian said, "and quite possibly the entire agreement." Daniel looked up, too tired for pretense. "I did my job." "You did more than your job," Adrian replied. "Most executives at your level would have left this to their technical staff and managed the fallout with press statements. You didn't." It wasn't quite praise, not in tone, but Daniel took it as the closest thing to respect Adrian had offered him since the negotiations began. For a brief moment, something like hope flickered behind his exhausted eyes, the sense that perhaps, after everything, this crisis had shown Adrian exactly the kind of partner he could be. He didn't yet know what Adrian said afterward, in private. Later that morning, in a closed session with his senior board members, Adrian addressed the events of the night with the same measured calm he brought to everything. Daniel Reed's technical leadership last night was exceptional, he told them plainly. "I want that acknowledged clearly. Without his intervention, we would have lost considerably more than data." Several board members nodded, already anticipating where this was heading, toward reassurance, toward moving forward with confidence restored. Adrian did not give it to them. "But talent," he continued, his voice unchanged, "without character creates dangerous partners. A man who solves crises brilliantly but creates them carelessly in every other area of his life is not someone I build a $20 billion future beside." Skill tells you what a man can do. It tells you nothing about what he will do. Once he no longer needs to impress you. The room went quiet. No one pressed further. Whatever decision Adrian was building toward, it was clear he had already begun making it. Carefully, deliberately, the way he made every decision that mattered. Sophia hadn't been in the command center during the crisis, but she'd watched its aftermath from a distance. Daniel emerging into the morning light, hollow-eyed and drained, accepting quiet thanks from technicians whose names, she noticed, he now actually seemed to remember. There was something different in him this week, something she hadn't expected to see. The particular exhaustion of guilt, not performance. He wasn't trying to charm anyone in that command center at 3 a.m. He was simply trying to fix what was breaking. It didn't erase 4 years of cruelty. It didn't undo a single wound. But watching him from across the room, Sophia found herself thinking, for the first time since the mud-splattered morning outside the hotel, that perhaps some small, buried part of Daniel Reed understood exactly how much he'd let himself become, and exactly how much it might already be too late to undo. The final board meeting was held 5 days later at Laurent Global's private conference retreat, a low-glass building set on a small island off the Maine coast, accessible only by ferry or private boat. It was, by design, a place meant for endings, the kind of location Adrian reserved for decisions too important to make anywhere convenient. Daniel arrived by boat that morning, feeling more confident than he had in over a week. The cyber attack was behind them. The rival's legal claims had been quietly dismantled by his legal team the previous afternoon, and Priya's engineers had personally told him the system integration was cleaner than anything they'd built with a partner company in years. As far as he could tell, Every obstacle standing between him and the signature had been cleared. He wasn't the only one who thought so. Every executive filing into the retreat's boardroom that morning carried the same quiet assumption that after 11 days of negotiation, delay, crisis, and recovery, today would simply be a formality. A handshake, a signature, the beginning of a partnership worth $20 billion. Adrian entered last, Sophia at his side, and took his seat at the head of the long table without any of the ceremony the moment seemed to call for. "Before we finalize anything," Adrian said, once the room had settled, "I want to share something with all of you." A screen at the far end of the room came to life, and the first slide appeared. Not financial projections, not integration timelines, but a single still frame from a security camera, a black SUV, mid-turn, tires cutting deliberately through a flooded pothole toward a woman standing on the curb. Daniel's stomach dropped. 11 days ago, Adrian continued, his voice even, Mr. Reed drove through a puddle outside a Manhattan hotel, deliberately soaking a stranger, and mocked her weight before driving away laughing. That stranger was my wife. A ripple of stunned silence moved through the room. Several executives turned to look at Daniel, who sat frozen, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his face. "I want to be clear," Adrian said, before anyone could respond, that this incident alone would not have ended our discussions. People have bad mornings. Cruelty in a single moment, however ugly, does not always reveal a man's whole character. He clicked to the next slide. It was a summary document. Dates, names, brief statements, compiled quietly over the past week and a half by Marcus Whitfield's team. A former assistant describing repeated public humiliation over minor errors. A driver fired without explanation after a delayed pickup. A waiter suspended after a manufactured complaint at a Chicago hotel bar. A vendor contractor who described being screamed at in front of clients over a scheduling conflict that wasn't even his fault. None of these incidents individually would disqualify a business partner, Adrian said, letting the slide remain on screen. People make mistakes under pressure, but a pattern is different from a mistake. What we found, over 11 days of watching Mr. Reed operate under scrutiny he didn't know he was under, was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a consistent habit. Cruelty toward anyone he believed held no power over him, and charm reserved exclusively for those he believed could benefit him. Daniel found his voice at last, though it came out thinner than he intended. This isn't relevant to the deal. My company's performance, the technology, the integration, none of that has changed. You just told this room yourself, I saved this partnership during the cyber attack. You did, Adrian agreed calmly. And I meant every word of that praise. Your technical leadership was genuinely exceptional. But talent tells me what you can accomplish. It tells me nothing about who gets hurt along the way while you accomplish it. He paused. I have built everything I own by choosing partners as carefully as I choose employees, and employees as carefully as I choose partners, not because I expect perfection, because I've learned that character shown under pressure, when no one important is watching, is the only kind of character that's real. The room had gone completely silent now, every executive present understanding, in real time, that they were witnessing something rare, a $20 billion agreement being dismantled not over financials, not over technology, but over a moral judgment delivered with the same calm precision Adrian brought to everything else. The muddy water, Adrian continued, glancing briefly at Sophia, whose expression remained composed, unreadable, was simply the final piece of evidence. Not the cause, the confirmation. Daniel looked around the table, searching for some ally, some board member, willing to argue the point, to remind everyone that this was business, that personal character shouldn't override sound financial logic. He found nothing but careful, averted eyes. People who had, over the past 11 days, quietly watched Daniel's temper flare at hotel staff, at drivers, at junior analysts, and had simply never mentioned it, assuming it wasn't their place. The board, Adrian said finally, will not be moving forward with Reed Dynamics. The vote, when it came minutes later, was unanimous. Not because anyone feared contradicting Adrian, but because, once the pattern had been laid plainly in front of them, none of them could argue it wasn't true. Daniel sat motionless as the room slowly emptied around him, executives filing out with murmured, uncomfortable pleasantries, none quite meeting his eyes. He remained in his chair long after the boardroom had cleared, staring at the frozen image still glowing on the screen. The SUV, the puddle, the woman he hadn't recognized as anyone worth treating decently. Sophia was the last to leave. She paused at the door, looking back at him one final time. "You still don't understand what you lost," she said quietly. "It was never the deal." She left him there, alone in the empty boardroom, $20 billion slipping away behind him, and the truth of her words settling in, far too late to matter. Paris in early spring smelled like rain on stone and fresh paint. 3 months had passed since the private island retreat, and the city was gathering for the opening of Fondation Laurent's newest project. The investment that funded it hadn't come from Reed Dynamics. In the weeks following the collapse of Daniel's deal, Adrian had quietly redirected the $20 billion toward a partnership with a smaller, less flashy technology firm out of Toronto, one with a founder who had, according to Marcus Whitfield's follow-up reports, personally driven 2 employees to the hospital during a snowstorm, rather than let them take public transit home alone. The deal closed in 6 weeks, with none of the drama, none of the crises, and considerably less attention than Daniel's negotiation had drawn. It simply worked, quietly and well, the way most good decisions eventually do. Sophia stood now at the hospital's entrance, a pair of ceremonial scissors in hand. A crowd of donors, journalists, and hospital staff gathered beneath a banner reading Fondation Laurent, Un nouveau départ, a new beginning. She wore a deep red dress that fit her exactly as she was, no different than she'd looked 11 days into the negotiation months earlier, no different than she'd looked the morning Daniel splashed her outside a hotel and laughed. She had never needed to change to reach this moment. That had always been the quiet, unspoken truth underneath everything. She hadn't built this life to prove something to Daniel. She'd built it because she'd finally stopped asking his permission to take up space in the world. Adrian stood beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, and when the ribbon fell and the doors opened to applause, he leaned close and said only, "You did this, not me." "We did this," Sophia corrected gently, because it was true, and because after everything, she'd learned the difference between people who built things together and people who only ever took. Daniel watched the opening from a hotel bar 3 blocks away, on a muted television tuned to a local news channel covering the event as a minor human interest story, a footnote really, buried between segments about traffic and weather. He hadn't planned to be in Paris. A smaller, quieter deal had brought him there, a partnership far less ambitious than the one he'd lost, with a company willing to overlook the whispers that had started following his name since the collapse of the Laurent negotiation. The whispers hadn't destroyed Reed Dynamics. The company survived, scaled back, chastened, still profitable in its smaller way. But something had shifted permanently in how the industry spoke about Daniel Reed. Word moved quietly, the way it always does in tightly connected worlds. A rival executive mentioning, over drinks, that Laurent Global had walked away from Reed's deal for reasons that had nothing to do with technology. No one ever said exactly what those reasons were. They didn't need to. The absence of an explanation was explanation enough, and doors that had once opened easily for Daniel now required considerably more effort to push through. He watched Sophia on the television screen, standing in front of a hospital she'd helped build, radiant in a way he hadn't let himself notice in years. Not because she'd changed anything about herself, but because she'd stopped needing anyone's approval to feel whole. The reporter's voice mentioned, almost in passing, that the hospital's new pediatric wing had already scheduled its first 40 patients for treatment. Families would never have afforded this level of care otherwise. Daniel set down his glass, and for the first time since the mud-splattered morning outside that Manhattan hotel, allowed himself to sit with the full weight of what he'd actually lost. It wasn't the $20 billion. He understood that now, watching Sophia's composed, unshaken presence fill the screen. The deal had only ever been money, significant money, career-altering money, but replaceable in time, the way most financial losses eventually are. What he'd actually lost was harder to name and impossible to recover. He'd been married once to a woman who had built an entire life of meaning and purpose right alongside him, and he had spent every day of that marriage measuring her worth by a number on a scale instead of noticing what she actually was: patient, relentless, quietly extraordinary, in ways he'd been too small to recognize. He hadn't lost her in a divorce 4 years ago. He'd lost her the moment he decided her body mattered more than everything else she carried inside it. And he had simply been too arrogant, for 4 more years, to understand what that decision had cost him until it arrived wearing another man's ring. He thought of the mud, the laughter, the careless cruelty of that rainy morning, and understood finally that it hadn't been an isolated failure. It had been the truest version of himself, the one he showed when he believed no one who mattered was watching. And it had been that version, more than any contract clause or technical specification, that Adrien Laurent had ultimately judged and found wanting. On the television, the camera lingered a moment longer on Sophia as she walked through the hospital's new entrance, greeting a small girl in a wheelchair with a warmth that needed no audience to be genuine. Daniel turned the television off. Outside, Paris carried on indifferent to his revelation, rain beginning to fall softly over the city. The same rain, he thought distantly, that had started everything 11 weeks and 1 lifetime ago. He had believed once that Sophia's value depended on what she looked like standing beside him. He understood now, far too late for it to matter, that she had always been the strongest person in every room he'd ever dragged her into, and that losing her, not the deal, not the money, not the company's reputation, was the single greatest mistake of his life.